welcome to this week's episode of Pro Democracy Pod. I'm here with my co-host Mila Garayeb and our guests, both of whom have already appeared on Pro Democracy Pod. We have Caleb Maupin, socialist organizer, journalist, Kit Klarenberg, investigative reporter. Two of the most articulate guests I think that we've had on the show so far. So we're really excited to have them on. And actually, Kit has recently put out an article on the gray zone. Let me just pull up the title really quick. It's called Leaked Files Expose Syria PSYOP Veterans Astroturfing Breadtube Star to Counter COVID Restriction Critics. So it's still up really high on the gray zone, even though it's maybe like a week or so old. But I wanted to have both Caleb and Kit on because Caleb basically wrote a book which kind of laid the groundwork for this investigation that Kit's done with Max Blumenthal. And I think that Kit's work has really validated Caleb's thesis, which is that basically the left-wing stars of YouTube, which are colloquially called Breadtube, are likely pushing an agenda of not just the elite, the left wing of capital, but of potentially the intelligence community. So it's a really interesting subject. Thank you guys both so much for joining us. I want to start with Kit. I think all of us on this show right now kind of understood during the Syrian war that what was happening then, not in Syria, but in the rest of the world, was the most sophisticated propaganda operation in human history.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that it's a vast topic deserving of another podcast in itself. But I mean, in brief, the Foreign Office, the UK Foreign Office, was running these multi-million pound annual efforts to destabilize the government of Bashar al-Assad, convince Syrians, Western citizens, foreign states, and international bodies like the UN, even, that the Free Syrian Army was this legitimate, quote unquote, moderate alternative, and flood media the world over with pro-opposition propaganda. And so, this would create situations in which you would have footage of real and indeed staged atrocities, say like carrying on the ground in Aleppo, for instance, which were filmed and produced by British trained and funded quote unquote citizen journalists, which was then fed to organizations like Bellingcat, which is funded by the Foreign Office and the CIA cut out, and the National Endowment for Democracy. And this would be presented in the mainstream Western news outlets as just organic grassroots citizen journalism. These are the facts on the ground. Not without any kind of indication that the people filming this and commenting on it were effectively working on a script concocted in London. And so, there's always, just as when soldiers return from war and they join, private security and intelligence companies and apply their skills in the private sector, there was always this risk that, once the Syrian crisis kind of fizzled out and it's a victory for for the Syrian government, that these people would come home and then turn their crosshairs on a domestic audience. And that's exactly what's happened here. And so, I mean, we'll get into this in more detail later, I'm sure. But I mean, in brief, this was a communications campaign for a British / American, I guess, English-speaking audience that was concocted and managed and orchestrated by an individual who was heavily involved in these Syrian information warfare efforts. And so I just think it speaks to the kind of world we live in now, where you can never know what's real, whether someone is, as I say, operating from a script concocted by shadowy actors unknown, and it's going to be presented as grassroots and natural and normal and independent, when in reality it's serving darker purposes and a wider clandestine agenda.
Yeah. It's funny you used the term like facts from on the ground. And I think of the media outlet, what's his name? Bilal, what's his name? The Al Qaeda guy, the American guy. Bilal Abdul Karim, yeah. Yeah, that's him. And his news out he's like a Al Qaeda propagandist. His news outlet's literally called on the ground news. So they're very explicitly they were very explicitly promoting that flavor. But there was this intense media campaign around organizations like the Free Syrian Army, the Syrian National Coalition, which was like the fake government. But at the same time, it got even more depraved than that with media campaigns around organizations like Jaish al-Islam, which were even more explicitly Al Qaeda affiliated, or a lot of it's like you can say, oh, they're Al Qaeda, but they don't even have to be Al Qaeda, because it's like they do the same thing as Al Qaeda. They think the same things. So could you talk about the connection between Jaish al-Islam and this Breadtube star, philosophy tube, Abigail Thorne, who you identified in your article as being basically an asset of a PR company that works with intelligence agencies? And correct me if I got anything wrong.
No, sure. Okay, so I mean, Jaish al-Islam, as you say, I mean, they might not be Al Qaeda, but they may as well be. I mean, these are the vilest people imaginable who, they paraded caged families in the streets when they occupied Douma. They used hostages as human shields, and then they attacked Kurdish civilians with chemical weapons. But Jaish al-Islam was one of many jihadist groups in Syria that received extensive kind of PR training and promotion from Foreign Office funded intelligence cutouts. And one such cutout was Incostrat, which is founded by the Emma Winberg, who went on to be the third wife of James the Measurer, who was the founder of the bogus humanitarian group, the White Helmets. And so he was, Amil Khan, he kind of floated around all of these different intelligence cutouts. And this is, I mean, perversely, in an official biography of Khan in one of the leaked files, it refers to how he had an ability to develop contacts in Arab-speaking conflict-affected states because he had a history, while he was a journalist for the BBC and Reuters, of establishing relationships with and embedding himself into terrorist organizations in the UK and the Middle East. So, this is not a particularly dubious character to be running any kind of communications campaign, let alone one that's allegedly in the name of public health. But he essentially, he floated around these different businesses. He provided communication support, PR support to armed groups guilty of absolutely hideous atrocities, which has been even documented by Amnesty International, which tended to focus on alleged regime crimes in Syria rather than anything the Western-funded Al Qaeda affiliates were doing on the ground. And so, at some point after this, he comes back to the UK and he founds this company called Valent Project, which it claims to be concerned with fighting disinformation, although, it seems to be very much concerned with perpetuating it. And so at the start of 2021, we're not sure when this was commissioned, but the files indicate that the Royal Institution, which is this like elite organization in the UK, which is ostensibly concerned with promoting science and kind of the empirical method, that they enlisted Valent to construct a covert communications campaign to battle against perceived vaccine hesitancy. And at the head of this was meant to be Abigail Thorne, who runs the very popular YouTube channel Philosophy Tube. And I can understand why it's popular. The production values are very high. She comes across very well. I've enjoyed watching some of the clips that I've seen. And as a caveat, as a disclaimer, she may well have been a good faith actor in this. She may well have had benign intentions and genuinely been concerned with promoting vaccination in public good. She may have been completely unaware that actually what she was doing formed part of a kind of wider, darker effort to malign any and all lockdown critics, and indeed anyone questioning, say, I don't know, vaccine mandates for children. But yeah, so I would urge your readers to go over the documents themselves. We link to them in the article, but it talks about developing and implementing a data-led behavior change campaign to achieve a cognitive shift in viewers. And this is all about, kind of framing any and all opposition to vaccines or vaccine mandates or anyone who's kind of ever so slightly concerned about this being forced on vulnerable people as anti-science, as anti-vax, as potentially extremist. I mean, it's really terribly insidious. And there's, there are various videos that Abigail has produced, which kind of would seem to fit this mold that's outlined in the documents. There's no disclaimer stating that it was funded by the UK government or the Royal Institution. There's no kind of, paid promotion logo emblazoned on the video, as in common with, any other promoted video on the platform. So, I mean, viewers have no idea what, if any, of her output has been influenced by her involvement in this, and also even if the campaign has come to an end, whether she truly has stopped being an advocate for the British state.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny. I think Michael Tracy pointed this out, that now you can be fully vaccinated and still be called anti-vax, and so it's kind of it seems like they're really ramping up the PR campaigns. They have to try really hard in order to really alienate this class of people. In Canada, our Prime Minister just made a statement that anti-vaxxers are racist or something like
that. They're racist and fascist. But this is okay. So this is another thing that, I mean, this is something that I find extremely disturbing, and and I think that as I say, from day one, from the very start of the pandemic, there has been a covert effort from these very same kind of psyops contractors who were involved in Syria and other kind of theaters of Western information warfare to frame, as I say, any and all criticism of lockdowns as fascist, as racist, as extremist, as potentially leading to violence. And, as you rightly point out, definitions of what constitutes anti-vaxxer have changed over time. So, now Merriam-Webster, I believe it was in October last year, they updated the definition from, someone who opposes vaccination to someone who opposes vaccine mandates. I mean, how long is it going to be until an anti-vaxxer is someone who opposes vaccine passports or digital IDs, or, someone who opposes restrictions crippling small businesses, or stay-at-home orders, or children are having to wear masks in the classroom. These things can change very, very rapidly and without anyone really noticing. And I think as well that it's more widely. I mean, this is probably quite hard to quantify, but it would be entirely unsurprising to me if quite a lot of dissident voices and kind of left-wing anti-establishment journalists and activists have remained silent on, have been uncritical and unquestioning of lockdown measures in public because they don't want to be associated with, QAnon types, which isn't understandable. I mean, I wouldn't want to either. But it's I wonder whether this has had a wider chilling effect on critical thought around the pandemic. I mean, is this really necessary? Is this in service of a greater, darker project of which we are not being apprised and of which we're not necessarily aware? And I mean, I find it myself where it's I got 2 Moderna jabs. I encourage others to do the same. And yet, whenever I have a conversation about the potential surveillance and social control implications of lockdown or indeed vaccine passes, etc., I have to engage in this prolonged throat clearing to explain I'm not an anti-vaxxer and I'm not anti-science, and I don't believe that Bill Gates is trying to take control of my grandmother. It's just the
he may be though. But that part might be true.
I mean, she's quite a looker despite her age. But I mean, I think that the space to say, okay, well, I'm not against vaccinations, and I'm even support, say, like a test and trace system, while also recognizing that this can be weaponized for malign purposes, which it very easily can and almost inevitably will be. The space to do that is virtually non-existent.
Well, I see a parallel here with Syria as well. Like, it's interesting to draw this parallel because you mentioned this chilling effect. And I personally felt very chilled, so to speak, both on my opinions on lockdowns and with this Syria thing. Obviously, the Syria thing for me, like, I'd been involved in Middle East politics for a long time, and I have like Middle East Christian family. And so, me daring to express concern about Jaish al-Islam would be seen to be not just Islamophobic, which is also absurd, but pro-genocide and stuff like that. And so like they take the playbook of today's whatever YouTube left, whatever you want to call it, Breadtube, or like this kind of crowd, is they take a completely reasonable concern and they make you feel like you are like fascist or bigoted or something like that for even having that concern, whether that concern is about religious fundamentalists taking over Syria or torturing Christians, or whether that concern is these lockdowns, which have been disastrous for education and mental health. And so I think it's interesting that they just keep using this playbook.
Yeah, I want to hear from Caleb on this, because actually it was not that many years ago that I was, first starting to learn about international affairs at a higher level. And Caleb and I worked together, and reading Caleb's writing at the time on Syria was really eye-opening for me. And you also were very quick to call out Breadtube. You were among the first to really give a deep analysis or critique of what's going on YouTube in left-wing circles. So I want to ask why you think it is that these people are pushing a regime change line on Syria, and now it seems like all the same people are kind of pushing a very pro-mandate, pro-passport, but pro-mandate line. And what's your take on all of that? Because you've really been, and you've been called a fascist quite a bit. I mean, nobody gets it as much as you. So.
Sure. Well, I published this book, Breadtube Serves Imperialism, and it's done quite well. I think this is my top-selling book that I've written over the years. So I think I did put out an edition of Gaddafi's Green Book, but that's not my own work. I wrote the introduction to it. That may have sold more copies, but I think this is, of all the things I've ever written, this is the top seller. And basically, I didn't know who Breadtube was. I don't follow this kind of internet world very much, but I was approached about 2 years ago by someone named Caleb Kane, who I'd never heard of. And he wanted me to have a debate with a guy named Destiny, who also his legal name is Stephen Bennell. I'd never heard of him either. So I asked around, my social circle, hey, does anyone know who this Stephen Bennell Destiny guy they want me to debate is? And people immediately said, whoa, you want to debate Destiny? And they showed me this guy, this huge YouTube channel, this huge following. He's a Twitch streamer. He plays video games and all of this. And I thought, okay, well, if this guy's a big deal, I watched a few of his debates, and we had a debate, and it went for about 2.5 hours. And a lot of people were like, wow, you did pretty well. I kind of wiped the floor with him. He didn't see it coming because I brought actual statistical data. We debated about socialism. He argued from the premise that socialism has never worked anywhere. I brought actual statistics about Cuba, about the Soviet Union, about China, about Venezuela, etc. And he had a very difficult time with that. So it was quite an interesting debate. And then immediately after that, I got sucked into this whole internet subculture that people refer to as Breadtube. And so I thought it was quite interesting, but I listened to a lot of these voices. And what I noticed was that while they were speaking as if they were full-on communists, full-on anarchists, full-on Marxists, their message was pretty standard establishment politics. This obsession with labeling anyone on the left who is at all critical of the status quo to be somehow a secret right-winger, a secret Nazi, a secret red-brown Nazbol crypto-fascist or whatever. That was very odd, I found. Support for U.S. interventions around the world, attacks on the various governments around the world, and then this belief that socialism is just a you and your friends start a worker cooperative business together. And quote, socialism has nothing to do with the government. That's a really common Breadtube thing. I thought this is a very, very odd world. And then I noticed that not only do these folks get algorithmic boosting, I mean, their videos blow up, but on top of that, they're promoted in mainstream U.S. media, the New Yorker, the New York Times, NPR, various outlets promote Breadtube voices. I mean, does that happen to, mainstream media outlets just randomly highlight social media channels by teenagers? I mean, that's not particularly normal. And then to top it all off, I found out that behind the scenes, they're being advised by a very shady individual named Steve Hassan. Steve Hassan is the leading cult expert in the United States, and he's got quite a shady history. He was involved with something called the Cult Awareness Network during the 1970s, where if your legal adult child became a Scientologist or became a Mooney or a Hare Krishna or whatever, you could pay Steve Hassan and his associates thousands of dollars to go kidnap your legally adult child against their will. And he would hold them in a basement and in some cases, tie them up and quote unquote deprogram them and unbrainwash them. That's a little bit disturbing. And his associate, Ted Patrick, went to prison for 2 years for doing this. His other associate, Rick Ross, also faced extreme legal challenges. And his group, the Cult Awareness Network, was bankrupted by lawsuits because they had this practice of going around kidnapping people, which is pretty illegal. And then right after the January 6th Capitol riot, we saw Steve Hassan himself on CNN, on national television, saying that the whole country needs to be deprogrammed from Donald Trump. And then we saw AOC, our esteemed freshman congresswoman, tweeting out that she agreed with that. And there needs to be a national deprogramming effort against the alt-right. And all of that was a matter of connect the dots, right? And at that point, I said that Breadtube serves imperialism, that there's probably a section of the intelligence agencies and a section of the U.S., status quo in terms of wealth and power that is supporting their efforts. They consider Donald Trump and the alt-right to be kind of a threat to the status quo. So they want to bring forward some kind of deprogramming operation to move people away from the alt-right. Well, that's all well and good, except that at the same time that they're debunking a lot of the allegations of the alt-right, they're also trying to equate the alt-right with legit socialists and anti-imperialists and waging campaigns against Max Blumenthal, against Gray Zone, against RT, against Jimmy Dore, against anybody who legit believes in socialism and is actually opposed to their regime change wars and interventions. So that all led me to write a book. And what's funny is that this book was it was a trolling operation in a lot of ways. I knew that they would immediately lose their minds and all do videos about it, which they did. And that's why it sold so well, is I got them to do promotion of it. And that was actually my hope. It was like bait, and it worked. The funny thing is, only the first chapter of this book is actually about the people. The rest of the book is about their ideas. I have a chapter on the difference between capitalism and socialism. I have a chapter on what fascism really means. I have a chapter on their obsession with degrowth. Most of this book is not about personalities. All that these people care about, though, is the first chapter where I talk about who some of the cast of characters in the Breadtube universe are. And that just drives them crazy that, I've got so much hate. How dare you insult my favorite internet personality? Oh my gosh. And that's the section that caused such a big firestorm. What's particularly funny is that these are not particularly, if I was looking for somebody that I would want to put out there as the voice of my ideology, the Breadtube crowd are not exactly the most upstanding people. I mean, you have a lot of failed Hollywood kind of people, failed actors from Canada, etc. I've always joked, we all know that the reason that Vosh, the great Vosh personality, I don't know if Ian Koczynski, Vosh, he's one of these big bread tubers. I've always joked that the reason he's so popular is because he's so good looking. I mean, when you look at Vosh, you just can't look away. I mean, he's just a knockout, just stunning. But the reality is that his father is a very prominent Hollywood personality, and you watch his father worked on The Matrix. He grew up in Beverly Hills. He's from a well-placed background, but the more you look into his background and how he kind of lurked in the streams of other bread tubers and has this odd recurring theme of talking about legalizing pedophilia and very, very odd details there. The more you look into these bread tube personalities, they're quite shady characters, I must say, the more you dig into them. The message they're putting out is not Marxism. It's not socialism. I mean, the name Breadtube comes from the book The Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin. And in my book, I talk about how Peter Kropotkin, is an upstanding individual. I mean, he was somebody who was part of the Russian Revolution. His funeral was attended by Vladimir Lenin. There was a subway station named after him in the Soviet Union. This was a revolutionary. I mean, an anarchist from more the anarchist perspective rather than the Bolshevik perspective. But he was an upstanding person. But what the Breadtube people believe has nothing in common with what Peter Kropotkin believed, has nothing in common with Marxism. It is just this pro-imperialist ideology that is about defending the status quo from opposition. That's why I wrote the book. And at the time, again, I didn't have a smoking gun. I mean, I saw Steve Hassan and his connections with them. Let me mention that Steve Hassan, his mentor was military psychologist Robert J. Lifton, who was the top military psychologist during the Korean War and the Vietnam War. And that was his personal mentor. And that Steve Hassan also claims to have a lot of inside information about the ties of the CIA to various cults. So Steve Hassan is a shady figure with an intelligence connection. Mainstream media is promoting them. The algorithms are promoting them as well. I figured, okay, this looks like there's a section of the status quo that is pushing this. I didn't know how right I was. Now, thanks to Kit's great investigative work, we have the smoking gun. We have the documents showing that British intelligence and the British royal family was bankrolling and promoting their work. And the best part of all of this is after the article by Max Blumenthal and Kit came out, immediately we got their response, which is a confession, because all they had was argumentium ad ridicule. They're not responding. There's an actual document there. They have no response to that. All they've got is, oh, the CIA funding us. That's crazy. Oh, that's stupid conspiracy theory. Well, it's not a conspiracy theory. I mean, the CIA, funding left-wing voices to counter legit anti-imperialists is like a story as old as time. The CIA brags that one of their most successful operations during the Cold War was called the Congress for Cultural Freedom Program, where they set up a magazine called Partisan Review that looked like a socialist magazine. And they put it all over the college campuses, promoting Susan Sontag and Hannah Arendt and Mary McCarthy, trying to destroy the reputation of the very famous communist and pro-Soviet writer. Now her name is slipping away from me. Very Lillian Hellman, the very famous writer Lillian Hellman, who wrote Watch on the Rhine and The North Star and the first Broadway play promoting LGBT rights, The Children's Hour. The CIA launched this fake publication called Partisan Review to promote all these pro-imperialist leftists and to target Lillian Hellman, the great pro-LGBT and pro-Soviet and anti-imperialist writer. And that they've been doing this kind of thing for a long time. I mean, they funded the work, for example, of the very famous African-American writer James Baldwin to counter W.E.B. Du Bois and a lot of black revolutionaries who were sympathetic to the Communist Party. The idea that the CIA might facilitate ideas that seem left-wing but are intended to counter anti-imperialists is not at all conspiratorial. In the aftermath of the 1960s, you had Ramparts magazine in the Bay Area revealing all kinds of CIA connections of all kinds of various figures that were part of the so-called New Left that were very anti-communist. So there's really no surprise here. This shouldn't be a shocker. In fact, they're saying, oh, it's crazy. The CIA would never do anything like that. It's like these people, like they live under a rock. I mean, go read Finks by Joel Whitney, all about how the CIA funneled money to various writers during the Cold War. Go read The Cultural Cold War Go read The New York Intellectuals by Alan Wald. This is a story as old as time. So the fact that they're doing what they did really since World War II in the 50s, and the 60s, and the 70s, and the 80s, the fact they're doing that now, why would we be surprised? They're just doing it in the age of computers and in the age of social media, right? Nowadays, most people get their news and their political commentary from social media. So why would they not take it to social media? They've been doing it in academia for a long time. They've been doing it with various leftist voices and activist groups. So why wouldn't they take it to social media? This is not a shocker at all.
Yeah, well, and they're doing it. One other distinction is that they're doing it through the NED. They're doing it through strategic consultancy firms, PR firms, that kind of stuff. So they don't have that direct connection. The whole point of the NED was to do what the CIA was doing, but not have the image of the recipients of those funds tarnished by that CIA connection.
Sure. Well, that's how they often do things. I tell people that, I work in TV. The CIA are like producers, right? The producer doesn't, he's not on screen. He's not the actor or the talent. The producer is not the writer. He doesn't write it. The producer doesn't pay for it. All the producer does is get people together and make things happen. The CIA doesn't pay for it. The Ford Foundation pays for it. The NED pays for it. The CIA doesn't think of it. The Council on Foreign Relations, the academics at the CFR, they're the ones who think of it and decide what's going to be done. And the CIA doesn't do it. They find some useful idiot to do it. And in this case, that useful idiot is Bosch or Thought Slime or Abigail Thorne or whoever, ContraPoints. I mean, that's how the game is played. And so, yeah, they just kind of sit behind the scenes and make things happen. That's the role that intelligence agencies like to play. And the Ford Foundation has been doing this for them. A lot of the Rockefeller think tanks have been doing this. This is a story as old as time.
Yeah. Well, with that, I'm going to end our Twitter live stream. I encourage everybody to join us over on Rockfin. It's rokfin.com/ProDemPod. We have more to come, so please join us there. And you know what? I really liked that joke you made, Caleb, about people watching Vosh because he's so handsome. There's a line in Kit's article that says reaching the intended. This is about the Abigail Thorne PR firm / British state backed information operation against anti-vaxxers. So it said Kit wrote, or Max wrote, reaching the intended viewers was forecast to be a significant task in itself. However, Valent noted most Philosophy Tube viewers are within the 18 to 35 age range, but, quote, existing research suggested the, quote, most prolific consumers of pseudoscientific material were over the age of 45. So this is the part that to me seems kind of, well, it's funny because they have all this money, all this data that they're harvesting through these kind of information campaigns, and they're still like basing all of it on really dumb ideas. So you're telling me that you want to reach people, Britons, over the age of 45. So you choose a channel whose most of their viewers are millennials, and the host is a liberal transgender woman. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. And it seems to me that like it's just like the class. It's like how the military works. They pour all this money into like defense contractors that have a track record of failing in everything they do.
I mean, I think that there's an argument to be made that, like, there's a huge grift involved in this. So it's like, all of these people have established. Okay, so this is just really quickly, right? So essentially, these Syrian warfare efforts, right? An internal UK government review, which was not meant to be published, but it was leaked to Middle East Eye. Its appraisal of these efforts in Syria was that they were poorly planned, probably illegal, and cost lives. Like, they led to people dying. This has not actually damaged the reputations or the careers of any of the people involved in this. And they can now again in a domestic setting, say, oh right, well we did all this, superb work in Syria. We know what to do. We can help you with countering extremism. We can help you with like extolling democracy and progressive values to people. Give us your money. But I just think that more generally that this is such an incestuous sphere. So if there's a kind of this rabid neocon think tank called the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, which is routinely kind of publishes quote unquote reports justifying the war on terror and indeed repressive actions towards Muslims and other kind of quote unquote potential terrorists at home. And so they, over the course of the pandemic, they switched their focus from wars in the Middle East and of plunder and imperialism to the pandemic, and they recently published reports suggesting that the radicalization of anti-lockdown protesters was the same as kind of individuals being radicalized by ISIS propaganda, and that these people pose a domestic terror threat. They call it a long COVID threat, totally unamusingly. But but bear in mind that Emil Khan appeared on a panel discussion hosted by this organization back in April 2020, arguing the exact same thing. It's a very, very small kind of cluster, a kind of constellation of individuals and companies with a huge degree of overlap who are, all vying for business from the same kind of companies and government departments, and everyone knows each other. So one of Emil Khan's close associates in Valent is this guy called Hamish Faulkner, who he's the son of a former British government advisor who kind of helped the Iraq war happen, he was working for the Foreign Office, and he met Khan while he was working for the Department for International Development. It's a very, very small, shady world of all of these people reinforcing each other and patting each other on the back and giving each other contracts. Just more generally, it does seem rather cat-handed that you're going to try and reach a specific target audience through a platform which is not watched by that target audience. But more generally, I think what you've got to bear in mind, I think that Caleb touched on this very eloquently, is the fact that one of the things that really jumped out to me when I was looking into Breadtube was the fact that there's and again, I'm sure Caleb will be very overly familiar with this, but there's a very, very long New York Times profile of a kind of a young individual who supposedly, quote unquote, fell down the alt-right rabbit hole on YouTube and was de-radicalized through exposures by Abigail Thorne and other popular Breadtubers. And this is what you've got to bear in mind, is that they call it algorithmic hijacking. So all of the Breadtube operatives, for want of a better word, they create all of these videos which are in theory meant to push people away from alt-right or far-right views and thus violence. But actually what they do is they try and envelop left-wing audiences as well, and they try and push everyone, irrespective of their kind of ideological disposition or inclination or perspectives, towards this one particular view, which is empire is good. Yes, as Caleb said, socialism can be purely achieved by workers' cooperatives and nothing actually too radical. It's all about dampening revolutionary fervor and maligning genuinely radical dissident views, and it's all wrapped up in this very bombastic, very self-righteous, very kind of fiery and often kind of inspirational sounding rhetoric. But then what it actually boils down to is don't question very much, don't do anything too, don't engage in anything too incendiary, and just keep on carrying on, because ultimately the system can accommodate you and can work. And don't think too much about what your government's doing overseas. It's a very insidious thing which envelops both sides of the political spectrum. Their scope, but also what they're saying is so broad that it can have mass appeal, even if they're not saying anything of substance.
Yeah.
Can I add something? Because Kit just referenced Caleb Kane, this New York Times piece out. And Caleb Kane is the person who introduced me to Breadtube. He reached out to me and wanted me to debate Destiny. And I investigated Caleb Kane, and he's also like a personal friend of Steve Hassan. Steve Hassan is like his personal mentor. They stream together, etc. But Caleb Kane's piece in the New York Times is like comedy, right? It's almost like self-parody, right? So it starts out with Caleb Kane. It describes how he bought a gun, right? He went to a store and, he lives in West Virginia. He bought a gun, and it's like you're reading this piece, and it's all about how Caleb Kane dropped out of college, got a job in a warehouse, and he started listening to right-wing YouTube videos. And like the piece begins with him buying a gun. So you think he's going to turn into like a mass shooter or a serial killer or like join the Ku Klux Klan or something like that. And it's like he's working in this Amazon warehouse and he's listening to right-wing videos. And then he starts listening to left-wing videos. The end. And it's like, and you're reading this, like, wait, I'm waiting for the part where he got like, quote unquote, radicalized. I'm waiting, and it's like, he does interviews. He did an interview where he's talking about how he almost went to Charlottesville. He almost went to Charlottesville, and like, this is supposed to be, and he's paraded around the media as the ex-alt-right guy. It's like, oh, he got sucked into the alt-right by YouTube, but he's seen the light. How did he see the light? He started listening to other YouTube videos. He got a new girlfriend. His new girlfriend was very religious, but was anti-racist. And so that convinced him to not be. But he almost went to Charlottesville. He almost went to Charlottesville. I mean, could you imagine a leftist? I almost went to a Black Lives Matter rally one time. I almost went to Occupy Wall Street. It's just like the stupidest thing. And so then he's on all these like mainstream, shows, like, just mainstream Young Turks kind of shows. And he's on there and he's like, we need to outlaw conspiracy theories. We need to make a law against conspiracy theories. And what happened to me doesn't happen to anybody else. What happened to you, dude? You listened to some videos, you changed your perspective, you listened to some different videos. It's like the most bizarre thing. It's like you read the piece, basically the message is, that there's people on social media who are encouraging people to commit thought crimes. And we got to make sure that those voices are suppressed, or else other people like innocent young Caleb Kane might come to commit thought crimes and do nothing about them. It's really bizarre.
I mean, just really quickly, like on this point, like, I mean, I think that you should always be really careful about those, former extremists who are like banded around in the media, because so often they will be state put-up jobs. And I'm not sure whether you guys or indeed your listeners will be familiar, but there is an organization in the UK called the Quilliam Foundation, which claimed to be the world's first counter-extremism think tank. And the two kind of heads of this organization claim to be two former kind of Islamic terrorists, they were all over the media saying that actually the explanations for radicalization of the Muslim community, like imperial wars of aggression in Iraq and Afghanistan, are wrong, and it's not because of discrimination at home. It's because there's something evil within Islam as a religion, and they were widely promoted. Anyway, they shut down at the very start of this year, and in the wake of this, journalist Ian Cobain revealed that they were actually, from the word go, a kind of intelligence services operation. Like one of the founders of biographies where he autobiography where he talks about becoming a terrorist was written by MI6, which is like British foreign intelligence, and that it was originally meant to be run secretly by the agencies, but then they kind of decided to just give it overt but not little acknowledged government funding, and this was later regarded to be a mistake. And a source within the intelligence services told Ian Cobain, that we should have run it from within MI5 and MI6. They do this sort of stuff all the time, and you never find out. Wow. So,
I mean, look at Anwar al-Awlaki, who,
yes,
after 9/11 was turned into the voice of moderate Islam in the United States.
I was giving talks at the Pentagon following 9/11.
Giving talks at the Pentagon, getting interviews from the Washington Post. They followed him around and in his car, and the New York Times. Everybody was raising him up as, and he was on Capitol Hill too. He did some kind of prayer thing there. And then of course, the FBI, it turns out that the FBI basically let him walk several times despite a warrant out for his arrest. And more recently, the Houthis in Yemen put out a phone call from CIA Director George Tenet talking to the president of Yemen and early 2000, the President Ali Saleh, about releasing an asset from detention in Yemen, and the Houthis say that asset was Anwar al-Awlaki. And then, of course, it all ends in a drone strike.
Drone strike. Yeah. In his last interview, he said that the CIA and FBI had tried to recruit him, which, I mean, it's probably
I mean, it's hard
realistic.
to believe otherwise, right?
Yeah.
And given his connections to the 9/11 hijackers and how he was allowed to enter and leave and had an arrest warrant, but it was stopped by the FBI at JFK International.
Sure. And when you get into this, this de-radicalization, deprogramming stuff, you're opening a can of worms that a lot of people in the intelligence apparatus and the media really don't want you to get into. It's the history of Project MKUltra, of CIA brainwashing and stuff. Steve Hassan, who is this mentor to Breadtube, admits, and in his interview with Joe Harbinger, he admits that the religious cult that he joined as a teenager and is now the most famous ex-member of the Unification Church, the Moonies, started out as a deprogramming operation. That in South Korea, if you were arrested for being a communist activist or a labor activist in South Korea, you would be taken to prison, and in prison, Reverend Sun Myung Moon would be given access to you, and you would be deprogrammed of communism by becoming a Unification Church member. So this cult that Steve Hassan is a member of is actually started out as a deprogramming operation. The ties of the Unification Church to the CIA are very extensive. And it was, South Korean intelligence. They were given the copyright to make M16 rifles in South Korea, very tied up with the Korean intelligence apparatus. And then Reverend Sun Myung Moon was brought to the United States by Richard Nixon to run basically a counter recruitment program against communists on college campuses. And so, this group that Steve Hassan deprogrammed people from itself began as a deprogramming operation. The more you get into this, the more murky it is. I think it's interesting what you're talking about, Mr. Awlaki, because I believe there's many quote unquote ex-Muslim terrorists who walk around U.S. media who are frauds. I mean, and they've just been exposed, especially they speak at like right-wing churches and they walk around. Yes, I was a Muslim, I was a terrorist, but then I found Jesus, and it's all a big scam. I mean,
there are some Palestinians who get touted around in the media who say that, like, we completely reject Palestinian statehood now, and it's all a terrorist operation, and
and they met a nice Jewish girl.
Yeah, or 15. But
No, but this is funny to me because I always had this suspicion about these ex-Muslim guys that like they still behave suspiciously like Salafis, like they still. So like at first I was like, are they just like, did they ever leave? Like, are they an op? But I think the Gray Zone actually had a good piece on this on Majid Nawaz. But it does touch on that really well.
He's one of the founders of Quilliam that I mentioned. Yeah, like he's this person who claims to have been a former terrorist, but then he was actually part of an Islamic political group that disavowed violence and all of this stuff. Like, so yeah, he's absolutely not this former terrorist.
Yeah.
Are you pulling up the piece, Mila, or?
Here, wait, let me see.
Well, it's funny too because Mooney started out as a deprogramming cult. Houseman, he leaves, starts this deprogramming operation, and now Breadtube is supposed to be deprogramming the alt-right. But it's not. It's interesting because they say that they're anti-cult. And a lot of these cults, it's not just the Moonies, but a lot of them work hand in hand with U.S. intelligence agencies. So the Church of Scientology, Falun Gong, MEK. Even when I went to a conference in D.C. on religious freedom not so long ago, back in July, I had a member of Billy Graham's Evangelical Association admit to me that they're conducting covert, secret missionary work in illegal missionary work in China. And it's hard to imagine that they're doing that without some kind of knowledge at some level in the U.S. government. So, I mean, these cults or whether you want to call it a cult or a Christian sect, I don't think that makes so much sense. But they're working towards, they're serving imperialism just like Breadtube.
Sure.
Yeah. So I have the article pulled up. So it was by Max Blumenthal and Nafiz Ahmed.
Yeah.
This one.
I don't think I've read this one.
It's good. It's good. And like there was stuff in it that I didn't even know, but basically like they were saying that he didn't even have the extremist background.
No, he didn't.
That he attested to having. Because at first I thought, oh, he's just still sounds like he is like an undercover Salafi. But apparently like there's like all these stories and that have been like disputed from like his brother and stuff like that. Like this one, the suicide bomb threat fantasy. And so he said that like he wanted to commit like a suicide bombing and whatever against the Nazis, and like turns out
thought about going to Charlottesville.
Yeah, he thought so I'm saying it has a very similar like playbook to what we're talking about now, like this like, oh, and then I was de-radicalized and stuff like that. And so anyway, I definitely recommend.
I watched a video from Robert Reich.
Became
a socialist.
I read a Paul Krugman column and then I became like
Sure. Well, about what Alex was saying before, in my book on Breadtube, I reference there's a book by the British intelligence officer Frank Kitson. Frank Kitson oversaw low-intensity warfare operations for the British military. And in Kenya, he was involved in putting down the Land and Freedom Army, the Mau Mau uprising in the 1950s. And he wrote a book called Gangs and Counter-Gangs. In that book, which I quote in the text, I talk about how basically he talked about how in order to defeat the Mau Mau, the British military needed to capture ex-Mau Mau fighters and mobilize them into what he called counter gangs, which were groups that looked like liberation groups that were fighting the British, but were actually gathering intelligence and capturing people and doing work for the British. And that was a way that they could defeat the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya. And there were other things that the British did too, obviously, like rounding up big chunks of the population and putting them in concentration camps. I mean, what the British did in Kenya in the 1950s is very horrendous. But if you go to the 1980s, Frank Kitson was also overseeing low-intensity warfare operations in Northern Ireland. And it has been revealed that the British military was funneling money to Protestant fanatics because it realized that having the British armed forces fight against, the IRA wasn't a good look. But if you found Protestant groups that would commit violence against the IRA, that would be getting covert, behind the scenes support from the British military, that was a way that the British military wouldn't look as brutal. It was a way to make it look like this is an ethnic conflict. Catholics and Protestants, can't we all just get along? And that was how largely you got to a situation where the Good Friday Agreement was signed in the 90s in Northern Ireland, and that this is a tactic that is frequently used. And, many people have pointed out on January 6th, all of these groups, all of these counter gangs that the USA has supported around the world were present. The Falun Gong, the Unification Church from South Korea, the Pahlavists from Iran, the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, the MEK, the so-called Islamo-Marxist terrorists that are working with Israel to assassinate Iranian nuclear scientists. All over the world, the USA and U.S. intelligence has cultivated a whole slew of these kind of fanatical groups to fight communism. And that is what they've been doing for many, many decades. And so, the more you look into these groups, the more you can see that's kind of how they operate. And, the cultivation of these counter gangs, or I believe in the writings of there's the guy who works for the Pentagon who talked about fourth generation warfare, William S. Lind. He refers to them as non-state actors. Right. And he argues that in our time, direct conflict between great powers like Russia and China and the United States would result in like the annihilation of the planet. So the way great powers fight each other is with non-state actors, and that non-state actors battle state actors. But non-state actors have their own ends and their own desires, which sometimes go against the interests of the country that may be covertly backing them. And I think that's what we saw on January 6th, when Donald Trump really pandered to the Miami Cubans, really pandered to the Iranians and those folks, and that their interests were kind of in a way at odds with the overall interests of U.S. imperialism. So we saw events like January 6th. But non-state actors are their own kind of thing. They serve themselves at the end of the day. And, during, in particular, the late Cold War, right, the 70s and 80s, if you looked at Africa, there were communist groups killing other communist groups in countries where it didn't make any sense. In Ethiopia, you had the Derg, the Soviet-backed military junta that took power. And then you had the United States arming this Maoist group to fight against the Derg in Eritrea. And then eventually you had the CIA backing a group of followers of Enver Hoxha in Albania to overthrow the Derg. And then as they came to power, kind of shed their supposedly Marxist ideology. And that this was how communism was defeated in the Cold War, was by making it so confusing so that it wasn't just capitalism versus communism. It was people didn't even know what it was about, right? I mean, you look at the Kampuchea War in 1978, you have Vietnam is attacked by communists in the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. So Vietnam invades Cambodia with the backing of the Soviet Union. Then China, with the backing of the United States, invades Vietnam. And you have Chinese communists killing Vietnamese communists who are killing Cambodian communists who are backed by Russian communists. It didn't make any sense, right? And making that kind of confusion is a way that you can effectively beat back any strong force of resistance. This is the whole point of the gangs and counter gangs. And that there's a lot of this that goes on where you see far left groups attack other far left groups, where you see this kind of, this confusion. And of course, if you're going to play this game of arming extremists and inciting them to commit violence, occasionally they're going to turn around and attack you. I mean, the Manchester bomber who blew up that concert in Manchester had been someone the U.S. government and the UK government had armed to fight against Gaddafi and Islamic extremists. So, they had armed him and unleashed him to commit those kind of horrendous crimes in Libya. And then he came back to the UK and committed them, and blew up a concert. And so this is a lot of what happens. And this is kind of the blowback of this policy of arming extremists and manipulating radical forces against each other, all to kind of create confusion so the people in power can stay in power.
Yeah, I mean, I think just really quickly, as a coder to that, I mean, I think that creating confusion is such a powerful weapon, and I think that actually, funnily enough, the British state may well, or at least elements of the British state may well be happy that these documents are in the public domain, because, as I say, it creates a situation in which nobody knows what's true and nobody knows whether the next kind of slick viral video they're watching online is actually, a state or quasi-state propaganda operation. So a
pro-democracy pod could be.
Yeah. I mean, I'm still waiting on my State Department check for it, to be honest. So if you can get them to hurry up, that'd be good. But a kind of one of the UK government's kind of favorite psyops contractors is a company called Zinc Network, funnily enough, over the course of the pandemic, it's done work of an indeterminate, unspecified nature for the World Health Organization and the US State Department and the UK Home and Foreign Offices. But we have leaked documents which indicate that they maintain a kind of a secret network of Russian-speaking social media influencers throughout the kind of former Soviet Union who promote quote-unquote media integrity and democratic values and complex social issues. And these leaked files indicate that their relationship is so intensive with these individuals that it requires daily management. I mean, quite why you need to be in daily touch with these people, and surely the propaganda operations are extraordinary. And this is supported by an in-house team of Russian-speaking producers, researchers, and digital growth strategists in London who, write their scripts for them, create these videos, edit them, and then promote them. But then Zinc advertises the fact that they do this on their website. So I think that they want that confusion. They want people to kind of doubt have that doubt and have that kind of lack of clarity about, like, okay, well, am I watching a propaganda video or is this someone organic?
Yeah.
Coincidentally, that Zinc has been engaged in efforts, like as we've been discussing since the very start of the pandemic, to create this false conflation between extremist views and activities and anti-lockdown vaccine hesitant views. And it's also published some research in June last year in June 2020 on how to market a test and trace app to British citizens, and this formed part of a broader research project on public understanding of and support for artificial intelligence, rather sinisterly. And then in September, a key Zinc staffer joins Facebook in a kind of senior threat intelligence position, and he's now charged with removing dangerous individuals and groups from the network, i.e., quote unquote anti-vaxxers. So actually, this London's influence over this globally is absolutely huge, and it's in ways that we do not know about, but it's definitely happening.
Yeah, I mean, and you couldn't be more spot on about how overt they are about all this. I mean, just think about the late night shows all doing segments sponsored by AstraZeneca or Moderna or whatever.
Yeah.
How long till we have independent media that's sponsored by Pfizer?
But it probably already is, but we don't know. That's
right.
The key thing.
Right. So, I mean, Caleb, working in media, I wonder what it's been like for you. I mean, it's been years since I've gone into an office, but what has it been like navigating, I guess, the media environment? Of course, RT is quite the outlier in terms of the media landscape, but navigating throughout this pandemic, what kind of, I guess, confusion have you seen in that?
Well, working in media has given me a new perspective, and what I've been through. I've been at RT for, I think, what is it? Maybe 6 years now. It'll be 6 years in March, or maybe 7 years. And it's interesting because prior to working at RT, I mean, I had done some journalistic work with Press TV, and I was a well-known communist activist. I was a prominent member of a Marxist communist group. And what's been interesting to me is that working in media has made me realize kind of what I realized at the time I transitioned to doing this kind of work, which is that there are very, very big problems on the organized left. And, when I was a Marxist activist, I was all about Antifa. I thought Antifa was amazing, right? They won't give you your freedom, so we won't give them theirs. Fight them before they come to power. I would get pumped about the Battle of Cable Street in 1936, where communists fought Oswald Mosley. And I was all about, let's go fight the right wing. And then I started working in media, and I started to realize that what happens is when Antifa does their thing, the right wing get to be the center of attention. They look like victims. Their arguments never get answered. And the left look like these crazy people with masks on who have no message and are just violently suppressing them. And it makes them the center of attention. There's no rebuttal. And it actually kind of works in the far right's favor. And it's like, oh, they're going to be somewhere. It makes them the story, makes them the center of attention. And I started to realize the Antifa stuff wasn't quite working out well. And then, I still am very much a Marxist, a man of the left, but I noticed that suddenly I was getting labeled as a fascist. And now I'm not welcome in a lot of left-wing spaces. When the students at NYU were occupying the cafeteria to support the cafeteria workers, me and several friends that, consider ourselves Marxists went to the cafeteria to support them. I was asked to leave because I work for a, quote, fascist TV network. They didn't have any problem with NBC and Fox News and CBS being there. But because I was Russian, I'm clearly a white supremacist, and that the left has gotten this like crazy cancel culture, I guess, where they are basically defenders of the establishment. And it seems like there's a lot of people that feel like that the way that they can prove that they're a good leftist or activist is they have a dossier on everybody.
Yeah, exactly.
And
exactly.
No matter
it's character attacks rather than the substance of your actual arguments.
Right. Yeah.
This person knows this person who knows this person, and therefore.
Yeah. Go on. Yeah.
Well, it just goes back to you were saying they were calling you conspiratorial for tying them to, you know, like British intelligence, for instance. But for some reason, it's not conspiratorial for them to like say, oh, if you report for RT, then like you must be a fascist, or
a spy, like
yeah, or like I recall Caleb meeting with like Alexander Dugin, and even merely talking to someone like that is fascist, but you know, getting funding and backing from these like intelligence agencies is somehow it's conspiratorial.
Right, a guy who has absolutely like no political power. Caleb met with him once, and now Caleb is a fascist Kremlin plot,
and that's bold.
And yet they love to read, what's that guy, Chris Evans, the Antifa Bellingcat guy, whose organization gets money from the National Endowment for Democracy, which is, you know, an offshoot of the CIA, and he's like an Antifa champion. It makes no sense. And you know, Caleb, before I shoot back to you, I also I remember one time getting kicked out of or cussed out at a march held by the Revolutionary Communist Party, the Avakianites, for working at RT. So I mean, and now Mila's going on RT, and Kit has also worked at. Wow, this is like the RT podcast.
Well, I got like people did push back at me for going on RT, and I at one point just like lost it, and like was just not lost it, but I was like, you know, people were saying that it was all right to like go on RT,
yeah,
or whatever. And
yeah, the first reporters to touch ground at Standing Rock were all right.
Yeah, and
you know?
So I said like, you know, at one point, and I really hope this episode stays paywalled, but I was like, tell him to fuck back off to the Iraq, because my friend told me like what her friend had said about me going on RT, and I said, tell him to fuck back off to the Iraq war-loving CNN, because it's just, you know, like it's so clearly ridiculous when you break it down. But these people don't want to break it down. Like they want to just like have that association like stick, and then just have everyone repeat that association, and that's that. You know, like
it's meme politics.
Yeah, it's been an incredibly effective psyop to like just to smear RT as like all of these different things under the sun. And I actually like, you see it like when the January 2017 intelligence community assessment, which you know, on kind of alleged Russian meddling in, it spent most of the document is about RT, and I wonder whether, I mean, bearing in mind this is like drawn up by like CIA spooks. I wonder whether that's like they're just kind of bitter because it's something they can't control, like genuinely, because it's like their ability to impact the way that the media reports on things and what they report on is huge in terms of like CNN. I mean, they have like CIA people on their payroll as like, you know, like weekly contributors, whereas like with RT they have absolutely no say over its editorial direction and what it puts out. So of course they're going to be angry about it, and of course it's going to be massively in their interest to smear it, and indeed anyone who contributes to it in any way as, you know, this, that, and the other.
Well, part of what they do is this kind of mirrors their overall operation, which is that I call it a light switch effect, where they create a situation where you're with the establishment or you're everything else. And everything else includes all kinds of crazy stuff, you know, UFOs and lizard people, and you know, and I've noticed that after any news event in the United States, nothing, if there's ever a mass shooting anywhere, 2 minutes afterwards, all over Twitter and Facebook are a bunch of people saying it didn't happen. It was all staged by the government. A lot of it's very easily debunked, but they've created this situation where you either believe everything said by the mainstream or you're in crazy land. And that's the choice that we all have. And that's a way of keeping people in the mainstream because they don't want to be in crazy land, right? So by calling RT alt-right, you know, by trying to argue that Jimmy Dore is somehow tied to David Duke or something like that, how they play this game where it's like everyone who's not on board with the mainstream is all part of this diabolical world of, you know, of people that are thinking for themselves or have bad ideas. And honestly, part of what goes on might be the promotion of some of the more outrageous voices in the dissident world. I mean, I think that it may mirror, on the one hand, they're promoting people that go after anyone who dissents. They also may be helping the internet fill up with crazy stuff to kind of drown out any legit criticism. And you know, that there's that document that Cass Sunstein wrote for the Obama White House about conspiracy theories, where they actually said that was their strategy, to fill the internet with false conspiracy theories to discredit conspiracy theories. When you look at that, it's like, aren't conspiracy theories already false? So why would false conspiracy theories be any different than the ones that are already there? And the more you look into it, the more, when they say conspiracy theories, they mean dissent from the mainstream narrative, right? Obviously, a lot of things that are considered to be conspiracy theories that are laughable or that are just incorrect, but that is the term they throw on everything. I mean, you know, our article, right? I mean, the article that Kit and Max put out has been labeled a conspiracy theory, even though there's a document. I mean, there's a document on it, but it must be a conspiracy theory because it says something that somebody doesn't want to hear. And it seems like that's a way you can just dismiss something. You say, that's a conspiracy theory. And I mean, you don't have to debunk it in any way.
Well,
I mean, sorry, just really quickly as well. I mean, I think that this. Sorry, Alex. I mean, I just think that this has relevance for what we've been talking about as well, because it's like, you know, the you know, any and all criticism or even questioning of, you know, the kind of of lockdowns or vaccine mandates or indeed vaccine passes has been so talked about and so falsely associated with, you know, fascism and extremism and terrorism and the alt-right and, you know, and people like David Icke and David Duke, that it has created this chilling effect whereby the left doesn't comment on these things, or they stand by the sidelines, but then this in turn gives a monopoly to the right wing entirely on all issues related to the pandemic. So, you know, like, you have, you know, authoritarian governments in Britain and America which are, you know, pushing, you know, overtly and covertly things like vaccine passes and digital ID. And the only real public pushback, apart from, you know, lone isolated voices, here and there, like such as at the Grey Zone, is from right wing fanatics. So you have right wing governments pushing this stuff, and then far right movements like opposing it, and, you know, progressive, dissident, anti-establishment voices who would usually be, you know, shouting from the rooftops about this stuff are completely silent. You know, it's been an amazingly effective psyop to toxify the debate in this manner. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to tack on to what Caleb was saying about these kind of Pied Pipers of the conspiracy community, whatnot. I mean, I remember just a few weeks ago, Vosh put out that. Well, he was streaming and he said that he was an informant for the FBI, and that's what he was doing while he was doing Antifa work in Santa Monica. And he was obviously joking, right? But then I saw a lot of people that are kind of more on our side of this conversation saying, see, he admits it, he's an asset. And it's like, obviously he's not totally stupid. He's not going to admit to his audience that he was an informant for the FBI. On the other hand, we see that there is a more complex relationship, a more covert relationship between the intelligence community and Breadtube. But it's not just outright like they're CIA employees. They work out of Langley, right? So I think that kind of, I mean, first of all, it was just incredibly stupid that anyone took him at face value, I thought. And then at the same time, you know, they do discredit our position and allow for those viewers, which is not a small number of people, to point and laugh at us and say, oh, see, they fell for this obvious bait, right? So, you know, I just think it's important to be critical. And I can't say how important it is that we have the leaks that Kit has brought to our attention, as well as Caleb's very nuanced analysis of this phenomenon, so that we can question power, question the mechanisms of propaganda operations and the flow of money without, you know, being like, you know, Vosh is a literal FBI agent, you know?
Sure. Well, and part of the way Vosh operates is he'll speak out of like three sides of his mouth. right? I mean, he will say something,
Yeah.
right? He'll say something like on that stream, right? He's like, oh, yes, I'm an FBI agent. Ha, ha, ha. On another stream, he will actually tell people, if your relative is into the alt-right or is part of January 6th, please
Call the FBI. Yeah.
turn them into the FBI. Well, geez, I mean, maybe you're not an actual FBI agent, but that's exactly what the FBI would say, right? On another stream, he will, say all kinds of things. So, there's a lot of that going on. The other thing is, we don't know who it is, right? And I mean, I suspect Ben Burgess, the academic associated with Jacobin, is involved, but he's probably not the only one. His name shows up in the credits of a lot of Breadtube videos. But Vaush has many streams where he will be reading a list of quotations from various communists like Lenin and Mao and stuff that argue that you should vote for Joe Biden, or argue that you should never march for economic issues because that's class reductionism. And it's pretty clear he didn't assemble this list himself.
Yeah.
He doesn't know the context of the quotes. He doesn't know any of it. He's just reading a script. Somebody assembled that list for him. Now, was it Ben Burgess? Was it somebody else? Another thing that I thought was interesting is he was ranting against my book one time, and he admitted that he didn't buy it. He hasn't read it. His father did. He said, my dad bought this book and he told me about it. And that just struck me. I'm like, your dad bought what? Like if someone wrote a book about me and I was going to talk about it on social media, I would read it myself. So why is Vaush's dad buying my book and telling Vaush what to say about it, essentially, or what it said? That was very, very odd. I found that to be very, very odd. And of course, we know who his father is. His father's a very prominent Hollywood individual. So there's a lot of questions here. The other thing I've noticed is that, some people say, well, why would they promote Vaush, right? I mean, it's like he's such an inarticulate person. Well, the thing is, he plays video games, and the gaming community is a hotbed of, quote unquote, conspiracy theories and a lot of like alt-right kind of views. On top of that, Vaush will go out of his way to be offensive. And in addition to the trolling with claiming to be an FBI agent and then laughing that people believed him, the other thing that he will do is he will, like, there's a recent stream where he's ranting about women that don't agree with trans athletes or something like that. But the words he's using, I mean, he's saying every misogynist slur you ever heard. That's not an accident. It's not that he's just that much of a misogynist. He's doing that to try and attract people that might be attracted to misogyny. The idea is the kind of gamer who likes to hear women being called these nasty words and would normally go to the alt-right, well, then go listen to Vaush, because Vaush just said all these nasty words. And that he does things like that, where he will go out of his way to say very offensive things, things that are quite inappropriate, to get him the attention of people that might be going to the alt-right, so he can then direct them to the mainstream left. That's part of what he does as well. There's a science to it, but the number of streams that you have seen, from Vaush that are purely focused on how bad tankies are, how bad Jimmy Dore is, purely focused on why you need to vote for Joe Biden, making very bizarre roundabout arguments, it's very suspect, right? And again, this all raises a lot of questions. And, so I think it's all worth pointing out. I would say probably the most articulate Breadtube voice by far is ContraPoints. She seems to take her job seriously. She actually investigates why people like Jordan Peterson, why young men might become incels, etc., and makes very well thought out videos that could actually convince somebody. And you'll notice that's gotten her canceled by the Breadtube crowd, because you're not supposed to, quote, sympathize with bigots. You're not supposed to do that, right? You're just supposed to cancel them and hate them. If the Breadtube brainwashing is essentially, if you hear a certain thought or a certain word, you just immediately start screaming at the person and don't allow it to go through. So ContraPoints has been attacked in the Breadtube community simply for taking her job seriously and trying to effectively deprogram the alt-right. I mean, it's kind of unbelievable, right? But that is kind of how, quote unquote, brainwashing works, is you inculcate a phobia into somebody, where whenever they hear a certain phrase, they hear a certain word, they immediately just put up a mental block and say, must not. And I've noticed in some of the reaction to this book, I've heard that. There are many streams of like low-level people, who will just have a copy of this book and they'll start reading it and they'll go through it and he'll be like, and he said the word Silicon Valley. Well, everyone knows that's an alt-right word, Silicon Valley. Well, Silicon Valley is a part of the U.S. economy, right? But it's like they have been programmed by Breadtube. Yeah. Ever hear anyone say Silicon Valley, stop listening immediately. They're right wing. And
they're anti-Jewish.
Yeah. And it's like, if you ever hear anyone say various phrases, immediately stop thinking. This is brainwashing. This is how brainwashing works, right? This is like evangelicals, right? I grew up around a lot of evangelical fundamentalists who were like creationists, right? And the second you said anything about evolution or natural selection, immediately they had this block that goes up. That's how mind control works. It's about making people afraid to think.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add, Kit?
No, not particularly. I mean, I do think. I mean, I think that you're spot on, Caleb, and I think. I mean, it's really interesting that that we had 5 years of this or that idea or that perspective being branded as like Russian disinformation. And then now it's like, in the wake of January 6th, it's right-wing extremism. Like, oh, that's a Trump talking point. Like, oh, to suggest the Iraq war wasn't, on balance a good thing. Like you've been exposed to radicalizing right-wing ideas. I mean, also as well, I just think that it's incredible, like the degree to which, these Breadtube people, particularly Vouch, who, always comes out with these very, what's the word? These highly contentious points, often in using really bombastic, aggressive language. And so, I mean, this is just something that I found really striking was all of the attacks on my article with Max were, I mean, a lot of it was, as we've discussed, character based, and a lot of it was just crazy stuff that was just so off the mark in terms of the article's content. So, a while back, Vouch said that he wanted Julian Assange to die in a CIA black site because it would trigger all the worst people on Twitter, like Glenn Greenwald, and like we included this as an example of him speaking in an extremely unhelpful way about genuinely radical progressive voices. And so many critics, if you can even call them that, on social media lined up to take aim at Max and I for oh well, he was obviously joking, and so how dare you include this in a wider critique of his work? And it's just like, well, I mean, it's still this utterly unspeakable thing to say. And like and he maligns and diminishes and criticizes people for far lesser offenses against decency and truth all the time, and yet because we characterized a quote unquote joke, I'm sure that his fiance and children find it utterly uproarious. By the way, this idea of the of Julian dying in a CIA torture prison, it's really extraordinary, and it does give me some hope though that this article it was read thousands of times. We got an enormously positive feedback from it, even from people who didn't agree with our position. So I mean, I think it's still, despite this kind of, what would you call it, this force field, all these multiply reinforcing voices telling you that this is unsayable and this is unthinkable. Actually, you can cut through to people even if you disagree with them. It's important to try.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I think we're going to end the show for today. Once again, I want to thank Kit and Caleb for joining us.
Pleasure.
Both of their second time on the show, two of our most articulate, most informed guests. It's such an honor to have you guys here. I'm sure we'll have each of you on at some other point again, maybe not together, maybe together. But I also want to make a quick announcement. Actually, really quick, I want to thank everyone who subscribed and donated, because it does really support Mila and I and keeps us going with content like this. On Friday, we're going to have another episode. Usually we do just one per week, but we missed last week, so we're going to do two this week. And we're going to have Jordan Arthur Bloom. He's a conservative journalist, and we're going to have Steve Poikonen, I think I'm saying his name right, who is with Slow News Day, talking about January 6th, going into that, the worst day in American history since the Maine,
since last week.
Yeah, right. So guys, thanks so much for joining us. See you on Friday. Hopefully all of you will join us who joined today. Caleb, Kit, Mila, thank you all.
Yeah. Thanks for having us. Cheers. Take care.
Yep.
And Kid, I'm gonna buy you a microphone before you come on again.
Are you kidding? I'm not.